All right, USC, give us some good news. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking USC football just a few days following the final national signing day in February. We've got Alicia De Artola on the line from Reign of Troy. Alicia, how are you today?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. So if we combine the season and combine the offseason thus far, not necessarily great news for USC, not a great look for the rest of the nation in looking at Los Angeles and the Paramount program in the Pac-12, not necessarily the best program right this second, but the program obviously in the Pac-12 is at USC with the Cliff Kingsbury undoing and unraveling of the hiring, although it's totally understandable. He's going to run off to an NFL head coaching job. And then the recruiting class not meeting expectations following 5 and 7. And just your thoughts about maybe what everyone's perceiving versus what may actually be in play right now at USC.
Yeah, it's definitely been a tough season, a tough start to the off season. I think the national perception is probably not far from where things are. Maybe it's even, I wonder if people in the national college football world understand how panicked USC fans are right now. Being in the USC fan base right now is a whirlwind of, I think, pessimism and negativity and concern, because it's not just what's going on at the football level. There's growing concern about what's going on with athletic director Lynn Swann and his control of the athletics program, particularly his involvement in the football program. There's growing concern about USC as a university. They don't have a university president right now. The university itself is embroiled in a bunch of controversies, and how that all then filters down to what the future of the football program is very, very uncertain, very cloudy. So yeah, the USC right now is in, it looks like, a little bit of trouble coming off a 5 and 7 season. That was really bad. The optics of the Cliff Kingsbury situation were very bad, even though, as you say, who could have believed that he would get a head coaching job? Like, that's, I think Arizona's reaching there a little bit, but it's still, the way it all played out didn't look good on USC's end. The way that the buyout and letting him interview and all of that, the optics around USC are very bad. Then you run into Brew McCoy signing, enrolling, and then transferring to Texas after 2 weeks. And then you run into the end of recruiting season where USC finishes with their lowest ranked recruiting class since recruiting classes were tracked, essentially. And then they cap it all off with Puka Nacua, the 4-star wide receiver who had been committed to USC since the summer, and he jumps over to a Pac-12 rival in Washington. So it just feels like the dominoes are all falling in the wrong direction from a USC perspective. And if the if the nation doesn't see it that USC is in crisis, then USC fans certainly think that USC is in crisis.
Yeah, the Kingsbury situation, I think, just happened at the wrong time, considering what else was happening around the program. Because again, anytime you hire someone, then they bail, it's not a good look, regardless of where they go. But then on top of that, as you say, that could not have been foreseen. It certainly wasn't by me. When does an NFL team hire a losing college football coach who did not perform as well as his two predecessors at Texas Tech? That never happens, but it was the right fit for them, they believed, based on his experience with offensive football and what he could do there. It's interesting to note, before we get to recruiting, we might as well dive right into the offensive coordinator situation, because Cliff Kingsbury, obviously prolific at Texas Tech as a quarterback. Graham Harrell, the same, even more so statistically, and he becomes the offensive coordinator. So at least there was some consistency in regards to, we would like to run this style of offense, have this type of dynamic impact and approach to offensive football. Therefore, we're going to go after this style. Graham Harrell, the next guy in line from North Texas.
Yeah, and all things considered, Graham Harrell is probably the best name that USC could have got coming out of the Cliff Kingsbury situation. So kudos to USC for making it happen, because it looked like it wasn't going to happen. And it does show a willingness to embrace the air raid. It does show a willingness to go with this style of system, which there was some skepticism about whether or not USC would persist with the air raid if Cliff Kingsbury wasn't on the board. There was a lot of talk of Jedd Fisch, who's with the Rams and who was the UCLA's ex-offensive coordinator. And I don't think that name would have incited any excitement for USC fans, but Graham Harrell brings in this exciting style of offensive football. It really suits USC's personnel. USC was already running a hybrid gumbo kind of pro style wannabe spread that didn't really have an identity. So they have all of these athletes to have a really explosive passing offense. They already have the offensive linemen who are built for that kind of spread front. So it makes a lot of sense to get Graham Harrell. The only question that surrounds Graham Harrell is, Cliff Kingsbury has had, how many years of running his own offense, whether as the head coach of Texas Tech or as an offensive coordinator at Texas A&M before that. A lot of experience for him, a lot to show for what he specifically could do with an offense. Graham Harrell comes from North Texas, 2 years as an offensive coordinator, which is more than T. Martin had when USC hired him, but still pretty limited. And he was working under an offensive-minded head coach in Seth Littrell at North Texas. So this is his first step out into his own control of things, and USC is going to give him control. Clay Helton has said that a couple times now, that he's going to have full control of the offense. Helton is going to step back and be more CEO, and that'll be the interesting thing is, does Graham Harrell now sink or swim? I mean, the track record, if you want to do the Kingsbury comparison, is good, but he still has to prove himself at that level.
And of course, there were few good offensive performances in 2018, especially against quality competition. When you point to the Texas game, when you point to just a number of games, obviously Notre Dame got off to a good start, but faltered in the second half. And not surprisingly, with a very young quarterback, JT Daniels, in play. But even the season before, the red zone performance was poor, even considering a top 3 NFL pick at quarterback, one of the best running backs in the nation, one of the best wide receiver cores in the nation, and still not able to scheme it up in the red zone. And you would think that would be more about approach and play calling than it would be about talent in 2017.
Yeah, absolutely. And there seemed to be, I think it all comes back to the lack of identity. There seemed to be a sense that they didn't know how to get the most out of their athletes. They were trying to pigeonhole some guys. They were trying to rely on having better athletes than the opponent more often than not, and that's why you saw when they would go up against the more equal, the teams that were on more equal footing from a talent perspective, they looked more on equal footing. They couldn't just deal with those mismatches. So that's one thing that if there's optimism about Graham Harrell coming in, his entire offensive philosophy is about scheming guys open. It's about scheming players into situations that gets the most out of them. So it felt like USC wasn't getting the most out of Sam Darnold. It felt like USC wasn't getting the most out of Ronald Jones. It felt like USC wasn't getting the most out of anyone in 2018, this past season. So that's the thing that USC fans and USC obviously is hoping will change in 2019, just getting more out of the incredible. I mean, you just think about USC lost Brew McCoy, they lost Puka Nacua in the recruiting cycle. And yet, if you look at USC's receiving core right now, there is an embarrassment of riches even then. You have Michael Pittman and Tyler Vaughns were top-level wide receiver recruits and have shown that they have that talent. Amon-Ra St. Brown is an absolute stud. Devin Williams, who was a freshman last year, along with Amon-Ra St. Brown, kind of an under the radar, but kid's got talent. So USC is not lacking for immense talent on this offense. They were lacking for getting anything out of it.
All right, folks, you want USC coverage. We have always delivered since we've been around for 4 or 5 years, but have under-delivered recently. So we are doing our best to deliver USC. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, as we bring you the best discussion, debate, and analysis in college football. So if you want this to continue, of course, smash the like button. Bring us a comment or two, what you think about the situation there at USC or across college football. And, of course, subscribe and share the videos. We've got Alicia De Artola on the line from Reign of Troy. And let's talk about the recruiting class because, yeah, it slid down the rankings. Everybody's zeroed in on just a number in terms of were you top 5, top 15, where were you? And when it says less than what it's supposed to be for that name brand, then there are concerns, and then you throw everything else around it. And, of course, it's what we discussed, Alicia. But still, a lot of talent in a hall that ranked, according to 247 Sports, as number 3 in the Pac-12, number 20 in the nation.
Yeah, there is some really good talent, and I think the talent that USC lost has definitely drawn the headlines. But you look at guys like Drake Jackson, who was a huge pickup on the early signing day. USC needed that help up front on the defensive line, or I don't know, they might shift him out to outside linebacker. It'll be interesting to see where he ends up. But they needed that guy in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball. They pick up two really good tight ends actually in Jude Wolfe and Ethan Ray, although Ethan Ray has fallen off a little bit because of an injury. Raylan Goforth is a really, I think, underrated linebacker out of St. John Bosco. He was the MVP of that league, and one of the best leagues in the country, and he's a little bit of an underrated guy who could come around. Kyle Ford obviously is the biggest name on the board too. Brew McCoy and Puka Nacua are huge losses, but Kyle Ford could be better than both of them when all is said and done. Unfortunately, he's also coming off of an ACL injury. So one of the interesting things about this class is how many guys are coming off of season-ending injuries in high school. And part of me wonders if Kyle Ford finishes his senior season, where does he rank in the end? If Max Williams, cornerback out of Sarah, if he finishes his senior year, does he rank a little higher? There's a lot of guys who maybe were limited for that reason. Ethan Ray is another guy. So maybe the class ranks higher if some of these players are healthy through the end of their season. But at the same time, that just goes to show that USC is also picking up a bunch of guys that are coming off of serious knee injuries. So there are some questions there, but undoubtedly talent that is reinforcing this team, particularly at some positions that USC needed to fill in some gaps. It's just that normally USC's filling gaps with, a handful of 5 stars and a bigger handful of 4 stars, and then they're filling in the class with 3 stars, where this year it's a majority. I think it's 18 3 stars and then 24/7 sports composite, which is probably double what USC normally takes as far as the 3-star caliber players. If you're thinking of guys who are projects or who maybe have, one identifiable skill that you're really looking at really, really fast, but you just need to sort of round them out into full-time players, or guys who are just playing in leagues that are under the radar and you're getting in on the ground floor with them. Instead, that's the bulk of USC's class. The bulk of USC's class is guys who you're hoping to develop, and then you're sprinkled around with the, Jason Rodriguez's and Drake London's and Kyle Ford's and Drake Jackson's and the higher level guys. But it's hard to balance because this class isn't a total disaster. It's just, I think USC was shopping in a different sort of tier than they normally are as far as getting the talent.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, on the line with Alicia De Artola talking USC football. You can join Alicia and the rest of the staff there at Reign of Troy. Of course, we deliver the best in college football analysis, discussion, and debate. If you want to keep it coming, please smash the like button, give us a subscription, and of course, share the videos as well. And we'd love to hear from you, and I respond to as many comments as possible. The growth has been remarkable over the last couple months, so thank you so much for that. Let's continue to grow. All right, talking about 2020, obviously the field's wide open. The targets are all over the place. It's going to be impossible for you to get to all the talent that's being looked at. But in regards to guys that are at the top of their game, at the top of their position, that USC has a legitimate shot at based on location, based at ties and relationship, who are some of the main targets that you feel could be coming into the fold?
It starts with Justin Flo, the linebacker out of Upland, 5-star, could potentially be the number 1 player in the class, and it ends with Justin Flo. Like, it feels like 2020 is just going to be Justin Flo watch. He's one of the better prospects to come out of California in many years, and USC should be in the running for him. And if USC isn't in the running for him, then it'll say a lot about the direction of USC's recruiting prowess going forward. So get Justin Flo and things soften a little bit on the recruiting end, and you're feeling a little bit more confident about USC going forward. Miss out on Justin Flo, and you're starting to wonder if USC really is slipping into the bottom of the barrel. USC already has a commitment from Bryce Young, the quarterback out of Mater Dei, top dual threat quarterback in the country, really talented guy, would fit Graham Harrell's air raid to a T. So hanging on to him is really important. but they're also going to go after the 5-star running back out of Buchanan, Kendall Milton. Kendall Milton is just stunning when you watch. I mean, all I've been able to watch so far is huddle videos, but he's an amazing prospect at running back. The kind of running back that USC, Ronald Jones was one of the better running backs that USC has had this century, and Kendall Milton looks like the kind of guy who could even be better than Ronald Jones for USC. So they're going to be in the running for him as well. But all of these top guys, all of these 5-star guys that USC is looking at are also being pursued by Alabama. They're also being pursued by Clemson and Ohio State. It's not going to be easy unless USC comes into the 2019 season and shows that they can stabilize the program and shows that they can win a few games. But there's definitely, I mean, California is a fertile recruiting ground. USC is going to have a shot at a lot of local or semi-local guys that are very highly ranked this year and could rocket back up the recruiting rankings. But Alabama and Ohio State are increasingly encroaching on Southern California, and USC's opening the door for them. UCLA isn't even interested in being in the conversation. So that's where USC finds itself is that if they want to hold on to their control of Southern California, this is a huge, huge cycle.
We've got Alicia De Artola on the line. You can catch her work at Reign of Troy. This is Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please support us right here as you have over the last couple months in particular. We appreciate that. Let's look at the schedule for 2019. So if anything, all due respect goes to USC scheduling. I always talk about this in regards to a number of Power 5 teams across the nation trying to protect their record, their postseason play. If USC, regardless of all their struggles last year, if they schedule lighter, they make it to a bowl game. Other schools do that. They never do. They never back away. Of course, they've got the Notre Dame game, as always, this year in South Bend. The other two games, typically anybody across the country, and if you go to the SEC in particular, scheduling 4 non-conference games, and 3 of them typically light for most of them, at least 2, you get a couple wins, but they have no automatic wins on this schedule. So I'm always looking at non-conference games, and then, of course, with the division set up, you play everyone on your side, and then I look to see who you play or miss on the other side. And, of course, Pac-12 football has one of the purest schedules outside the Big 12 than any of the Power 5s, because there's only 12 teams and they play 9 conference games, so they only miss 2 games, which I think is a good thing. So if we look at the non-conference games first, Alicia, Notre Dame, Fresno State, who, of course, won the Mountain West and defeated UCLA and Arizona State this past season, and a game on the road against BYU that always loads up against the Pac-12 in regards to scheduling. So aside from Notre Dame, those aren't monster matchups, but they're challenges for a program that's kind of in transition right now.
Absolutely. They're games that I think would be a potential slip up, even if USC was coming off of a better season, particularly Fresno State being, Fresno State in some years, it could be a lot easier than going into the past 2 seasons. Actually, USC, not the last 2 times that USC has played Fresno State, they've been coming off of really, really excellent seasons. So it's funny the way that works out. But the schedule is really interesting in the sense that, like you said, they're not, these aren't world beaters. These aren't instant losses for USC, but it feels like USC's particularly opening schedule, because that's where the out of conference is coming from. Like, USC could go 0-3 in the non-conference, and that is a very, very weird feeling to be in. And that's much more of a reflection of where USC stands right now than necessarily the makeup of that out of conference schedule. If USC comes into this season and plays up to the level of its talent, then USC should be heavily favored against Fresno State, heavily favored against BYU, and then obviously the Notre Dame game, you flip a coin there, regardless of what the form of either of those teams are. But when you're looking at it now, having to go on the road to BYU, USC has been notoriously poor on the road over the last couple of years. Under Clay Helton, the road has not treated USC well. They haven't traveled well. And so suddenly a BYU team that in other years you'd look at it and say, yeah, it's a little tough, but USC still is going to out-talent them at practically every position. it suddenly looks like, well, I don't know, when you put USC on the road, they don't always play up to their level, and they often get caught, stumbling through. And then the big one, Fresno State at the Coliseum to start the season. That's going to be the thing that sets the tone for everything. If USC struggles in that game, and they've struggled, they didn't lose games to Western Michigan 2 years ago. They didn't lose that game, but they weren't convincing in that game, and they haven't been convincing in that opening sort of group of five contest that they tend to have every year. And if USC, coming off of the 5-7 season, is less than convincing against this Fresno State team, with Jeff Tedford doing a hell of a job with that team, and lose at the Coliseum to start the year, then get your pitchforks ready, because USC fans are not going to be very excited when Stanford comes to the Coliseum the next week.
Yeah, it's difficult to play at BYU, regardless of how good they were, which 2 years ago they were awful with 3 wins. They bounced back to a certain extent last year and finished out at 7-6, played Utah extremely close. So if you go into that game at 0-2, because the Stanford game is, as it typically is, that first Pac-12 game. And again, Fresno State's no joke. They beat 2 teams in your division last year. And yeah, it's a difficult run, and there are no gimmies on the schedule, as they're typically, again, if you scan the schedules as I do, and I rank them all in the Power 5 each and every season, every school across the country, meaning 99% of them, schedule absolute locks, gimmies from the FCS or the low-level group of 5. And USC just typically doesn't do that. I know that they had, Western Michigan a couple of years ago, but they were coming off a PJ Fleck undefeated regular season, and they weren't quite as good that year, but they gave USC a tussle. And then, of course, I think it was Nevada to start out last year, if I remember correctly. But it's a difficult schedule. No Oregon State. You don't even get Oregon State to lean on in the Pac-12 North. So you miss Oregon State, miss Washington State, of course, that almost won the Pac-12 North last year. So a bit of a balance there in regards to difficult teams to miss in the Pac-12 North. So there's not even the Beavers there to notch a win for sure.
Yeah, Oregon State would have been a nice schedule softener, and instead USC misses Oregon when Oregon is down, and is about to get Oregon back when Oregon looks like they're on the upswing. On top of also getting a trip to Seattle to face Washington, and just talk about the first six games of the season. You got those 3 out of conference games, but you also got a really, really front heavy Pac-12 schedule. You get Fresno State, then you get Stanford, which Stanford is always going to be a tough team, and they're always going to give USC a challenge, and that game is always going to be a trendsetter, essentially. Then at BYU, and then you get Utah at home, which Utah away from Rice-Eccles is not the same prospect as they are on the road, but Utah is going to be USC's biggest rival for the Pac-12 South, you'd expect. So that's a huge, huge South game that could ultimately decide the division, coming off of a really tough first 3 games, coming out of a road game on a Friday. And then to the next week you have to travel to Seattle to face Washington, a Washington team that had another really good recruiting class this year, that Chris Peterson seems to be establishing more and more each year. And you expect them to be, in the hunt for the Pac-12 title again this year. And then a bye week comes to give you a little bit of a breather before USC gets Notre Dame, traveling to South Bend for Notre Dame. So you look at the 3 out of conference games there, and the 3 conference games there in that first 6 weeks. There's a lot to hold your breath on, and a lot to worry about, because 3 of the best teams in the Pac-12 are in that first 6. And then you still are going to have to face Oregon later in the season, still going to have to finish off the season against UCLA. So it's rough. It's rough for USC. But again, looking at the schedule again, it's rough for USC because USC is coming off a 5-7 season. The only team on this schedule that undoubtedly has at least as much talent as USC is Notre Dame. That remains the case. And that is, if there's a saving grace for USC, it's that. As good as Washington has been, as good as Chris Peterson has been at developing that team and bringing in better recruits in recent years, USC pound for pound still should be able to compete with Washington on a talent level. Same with Stanford, especially with Utah, Oregon, all of these teams. If USC has their stuff in order, then this is a very difficult schedule, but still one that it's not impossible to imagine USC being favored in many of these games if they get off on a strong foot. It's just that if USC starts slipping early, it's not inconceivable for an 0-6 start. And that, just uttering those words out loud, is for a USC fan is just mind blowing.
So before you jumped on the first six narrative, I was right there with you. And the first thing I thought was they could not play horrible and be 2-4. Maybe 3-3 is a goal, which seems like blasphemy at USC to say we'd like to split the first six games. And that would most likely mean I guess, mean 2-1 in the Pac-12 and 1-2 losing to Notre Dame, or the other way around in some combination. I won't try to break it down, but I typically in projecting records group games and not say they're definitely going to win that one, they're definitely going to lose that. I think you can group them together and be more accurate doing that. But it's a rough ride for USC. There's no question about it. But as you mentioned, I was going to question you on the Washington comparison from a pure talent standpoint. You're saying USC is not decidedly, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you would say has the better talent on the roster than Washington.
I would say that if you were looking at recruiting rankings, 4-year averages, 5-year averages, USC is still probably well ahead of Washington in that sense. The great equalizer is that Chris Peterson has done an amazing job of developing his talent, where USC has not, decidedly. I mean, I was on Twitter. I wish I still had that tweet. Somebody had mentioned the draft picks that Chris Peterson has produced at Washington over the years, and they weren't, the draft picks that USC has produced over the years. They're generally, the 4 or 5-star guys. There's a couple exceptions to that. Uchenna Nwosu comes to mind, but for the most part, guys who arrived at USC as considered very talented, leave USC as considered very talented, but not necessarily much better off than where they were from year one, which has been a big problem, where that's the exact opposite at Washington. Washington is growing their players and getting the most out of their players. So if I were to say, pure talent, pure athletic talent in as sort of stripped down a sense, then yeah, I think that USC probably is a more talented team in that sense. Is USC a more talented team in terms of the actual football skills that one develops at the college level? Well, Washington, just look at their record over the past few years. I think they've performed better than USC, and you have to give Chris Peterson credit for that. But I will say that the interesting thing to note is the last time USC went up to Seattle, 2016, USC's defensive front had their way with Washington, and that was the difference in that game, aside from Sam Darnold throwing some really incredible passes. But you could see what USC looks like when they're getting the most out of their talent, and that was one of the arguably the best game of Clay Helton's coaching career, arguably even better than that Rose Bowl, because that Rose Bowl was just so wild. I don't know if it reflects coaching so much as just the weird swings of a game. It was exciting, but in terms of pure performance level, USC's last trip to Washington was probably the best in the Clay Helton era. So you sort of see where USC could be if they're at that level again. Predicting that they'll be at that level again, yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, I just mentioned that to a Washington guy just yesterday, Chris Fetters from Dogman, that the last time they made the college football playoff, of course, in 2016, that many of us didn't even believe they were the best team in the conference because they had a light schedule. The one loss was USC coming to their place, winning by 2 scores, being decidedly the better team on that day, and then USC obviously closing out very strong and winning the Rose Bowl. Yeah, then the last thing I'll hit you with is there's a missed opportunity here because it's just not good timing for the program, because this is the elite program in the conference and certainly in the division. There is no other program that's anywhere close historically or recently to USC. And everybody else is actually down from what they typically are. For the most part, Utah's pretty much playing where you would expect Utah to be, a fringe top 25 program. Arizona is like traditionally a top 50 program that's usually winning 6 or 7 ball games and barely getting to postseason play. UCLA is a bit of a wild card, but has probably the best chance in terms of resources and location to challenge USC. Colorado's been awful for 15 years, excluding the one aberration 2 years ago, 3 years ago, getting to a Pac-12 championship game. And Arizona State, historically, yeah, they're like a top 40 program that sometimes has its run of good years. But in particular, this is the program in the division that should completely own what might be the worst division in college football.
It should, and the fact that USC isn't the 100% gonna roll through the Pac-12 South prediction, that they're not there, is a huge indictment on USC. I mean, it would be one thing if USC was slightly down and the rest of the Pac-12 was doing really well, and that's why USC wasn't in the mix there. But as you said, this is a down Pac-12. The Pac-12 South is not competitive, and USC didn't win it last year, which is a huge indictment. Isn't necessarily going to be the odds-on favorite to win it this year, and that's, for USC fans, that is 100% unacceptable. I think there's a possibility that USC comes in this year and fixing the offense fixes everything potentially, and there's a chance they could just roll through the South and get to the Pac-12 title game, and then you roll the dice in that one. But at the same time, USC could be out of it by the start of October. If USC loses to Stanford and Utah and Washington State, then that's probably the South gone. So it's a weird situation for USC to be in. It's a weird situation for the South to be in too. I was having this conversation with someone the other week. It's weird that the Pac-12 is so down when, if you asked me about the quality of the coaching in the Pac-12, particularly the Pac-12 South, has it gotten better over the last 5 years? I would probably tell you, yeah. I mean, Clay Helton, maybe not. I don't know. It just depends on where you rank Helton next to Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian. But Utah's in a better spot. Colorado, I don't know. They were in a better spot. It's hard to say now. Arizona made a huge hire in Kevin Sumlin. Obviously, didn't work out in year one, but that was a big hire for them. ASU has taken their chance with Herm Edwards, but he looks like he's doing a pretty decent job. So this, and obviously UCLA getting Chip Kelly, that was another swing for the fences hire for them. So I'm curious, in year two with so many of these coaches, will the South take off a little bit more? Will they become a little bit more legitimate? Or is it just one of those things where everything in the South is going wrong and it's not helped by everything in the North going pretty well right? Washington and Oregon and Stanford are all recruiting very well. They're all very strong. Washington State under Mike Leach is in a bright period for them. So the fortunes of those two, I mean, just think about like Cal in the North. Cal in the South would probably be one of the favorites to win the division. And yet Cal in the North is going to find it really hard to not finish, in the top half of that. I mean, they'll finish ahead of Oregon State, but nothing else is guaranteed, right? So it's a very, very weird situation. But if there's hope for the South, it's that there is potential there on the coaching front, but you still need to see a lot more proof, I guess, from the likes of Chip Kelly and Kevin Sumlin and Herm Edwards and obviously USC.
Alicia De-Artola from Reign of Troy helping us break down USC in the Pac-12. Alicia, we appreciate you stopping by and giving us so much time.
Yeah, for sure. It's been fun, as always.
Very good.